Telling stories was one of the few ways the crew could pass time out in space. The timeless passage of hours that seemed more like everything was standing still instead of moving. Being this far away from home meant there was no sun traveling on its daily, gradual arc overhead, nothing to remind everyone that the world was still moving, that time was still passing. Outside the windows of the research station was the endless expanse of space. Stars over an inky void that stretched infinitely outwards in every direction. Well, almost every direction. It was the station's chief engineer, C. Graham's turn to share a tale with the research crew aboard Observatory Site 13 as they orbited Mercury. The other three were hardly listening with rapt attention, but if it came down to a choice between focusing on Graham's words or thinking about the huge, terrifying spatial phenomenon outside the hull of the station, the others were glad to hear what he had to say. Anything to avoid looking out at the portholes at X0620. Perhaps out of nostalgia for being back on Earth, Graham started recalling a story about a woman named Martha, someone he had lived with along with a group of fellow personnel in accommodation near one of the Foundation's containment facilities. A house share, one building containing smaller apartments, everyone living on top of each other. According to the chief engineer, Martha was something of an oblivious roommate. She would often forget to lock the front door of the apartment before she left for blackjack evenings with her friends. On one occasion, Chief Engineer Graham came home to discover that Martha had left the gas stove on in the apartment, which could have burned the entire residential section of their building down if it had gone unnoticed. So, as Graham told the rest of the crew, one could only imagine his irritation to return home one day after a long day's work at the Foundation to find the front door left wide open. All the lights in the house were switched off, and the car had been left stationary in the driveway. From this, Graham figured that Martha must have hitched a ride to work with Carol, another of hers and Graham's colleagues at the Foundation. On her way out, Martha must have forgotten to shut the front door, or if it hadn't been closed properly and the wind had caused it to open. Walking up to the open door, Graham saw nothing inside but pitch darkness. But as he stepped over the threshold and into the house, he quickly learned the place wasn't as empty as it first seemed. Martha stepped down the staircase towards Graham, immediately greeted by questions from her housemate about if she'd forgotten to shut the door properly before leaving with Carol or heading off to play cards. But Martha looked back at him, horror on her face. She hadn't been out all day, she told Graham. Carol had called in sick, so there was nobody to hitch a ride from. Then she added worryingly, "I thought I told you a minute ago when I heard you opening the door from upstairs." A second later, both Graham and Martha had jumped into their car, speeding away from the house and whoever else had managed to get inside. Neither one of them slept well when they arrived at Carol's. Later, the police were called to come and investigate. They found no signs of forced entry. Even then, the two housemates didn't want to take any chances and made requests to be moved to new Foundation-provided housing. That was partially how Graham had ended up aboard the OS-13. Martha, still back on Earth, had been saying ever since that she found herself less afraid of the thousands of anomalies contained within the walls of the Foundation, nearly all of which could kill her. What scared her more was whatever was lurking on the other side of the unknown. It had been December the 22nd of 2019 when Graham recounted this unnerving tale aboard the SCP Foundation's Observatory Site 13. The exact same day, moments after he'd told the rest of the crew about Martha and the ominously open door, instruments aboard the station observed a slight change in X0620. The gravitational lensing across its event horizon had increased by a factor of 5. So much so that the light around it started cycling around the aperture of X0620 at a spin rate of 0.92. That also happens to be the same speed at which, according to Albert Einstein, causes the distortion of space itself. The change was recorded by OS-13, but went relatively unnoticed by the rest of the crew. However, 3 days later, airlocks 1 through 3 of the station suddenly depressurized. Without any warning, the 3 hatches leading out into the cold vacuum of space flung open and threw the inside of the station into chaos as the crew's oxygen began escaping. Fortunately, by acting quickly, Chief Engineer Graham was able to reseal the airlocks successfully, and prevent any further catastrophe. No injuries were reported by the crew, and the chief engineer attributed the mechanical malfunction to an issue with OS-13's onboard computer. It was behaving as if afflicted with a virus of some kind, but it was unclear how or when this malicious code had breached the computer. February the 9th of the following year, and the storytelling baton was passed to Jay Hart, OS-13's scope specialist. She posed an all too familiar and all too unnerving question to the rest of the crew, asking if they'd ever experienced the feeling of being watched. Hart then went on to describe a time when she and her golden retriever, Stacy, had been living out in Nebraska, about an hour's drive from Whitman. In other words, the middle of nowhere. And this was before Hart was assigned to a research station in deep space. She recalled how Stacy would often bark at strange hours of the night towards certain areas of the woods that were directly outside one of the windows of Hart's Nebraska homestead. At first, she just attributed it to local wildlife bothering or exciting her dog, like raccoons digging through the trash, even shadows that were playing tricks on Stacy's eyes as she got older. Even on the few times she went to check for herself, Hart never saw anything out there, apart from shadows and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It made it all the easier to assume her dog was just barking at nothing. As the nights went on, Stacy's barking became more frequent and more energetic, loud enough to keep Hart up when she would try to sleep. So one evening, she decided to install security cameras around the perimeter of the house to figure out exactly what was going on. The cameras were smaller versions of the kinds installed aboard the OS-13, capable of detecting nearly anything across the electromagnetic spectrum. With this new home security system in place, Hart settled in for the night and braced herself for Stacy to start barking again. Sure enough, around the usual time, the retriever started up again. Only this time, Hart could hear Stacy whimpering in the living room. She heard the dog scratching at the underside of the bedroom door, startling Hart at first, only to open the door and discover Stacy on the other side, eager to get in bed and be with her owner. The dog rushed in and hopped into Hart's bed, as if she was afraid to be left alone with whatever was out there. The pair spent the rest of the night curled up together under the sheets, Hart and her keeping each other calm. The next morning, Hart checked the footage from the cameras, checking the time code where Stacy started barking. At that moment, one of the cameras seemed to have picked up on something just beyond the tree line, the silhouette of a figure. It was standing deathly still, arms rigidly by its side and its face obscured, too blurry and far away to clearly make out any features, but it seemed to be staring directly into the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. Hart concluded by being thankful for Stacy's barking, keeping what seemed to have been a potential stalker or home invader at bay, advising the rest of the crew to trust a dog's senses over their own. An hour later, another abnormal chant was observed at X0620. At irregular intervals, abnormal pulses of gamma rays were detected coming from its accretion disk. Scope specialist Hart even noted in her personal log that it looked like X0620 was blinking at her. Over the following weeks, Hart displayed unusual behavior, refusing to examine X0620 for extended periods of time, very noticeably shaken and even paranoid. At several points, the other crew members overheard her talking to herself in her quarters saying, "It followed me. It must have followed me here." On the 31st of March, 2020, OS-13's radio astronomer, Forrester, was recorded talking about an experience that had given him an aversion to being underwater. In his childhood, his brothers would constantly cannonball into the deep end of the public swimming pool, while a younger Forrester would be over at the shallow end in tears until his parents removed him from the water, or worse, his brothers pushed him into the deep end as a prank. This was not the same as the fear many people have of what's lurking in the deepest, darkest depths of the ocean. This was a public pool, clear water mixed with blue chloride and sweat. What unnerved Forrester the most about being beneath the water wasn't what he could or could not see. It was what he heard when his head dipped below the surface. Every time he went underwater, for as long as he could remember, there was a sound beneath the muffled shrieks and splashing of kids in the pool above him. Under the water, Forrester could always hear someone crying. It was a low, dull weeping, the kind that told even a young child that the crying was the result of something terrible happening. the kind of something that nobody ever came back from. It had always emanated from the deep end of the pool, the parts that were darker and obscured by shadows, where air bubbles rushed upwards from storm drains. Forster had only been 6 years old when he first heard the crying, convinced that there must be someone trapped underneath the pool, pinned under the water. It was only when he was slightly older that Forster discovered someone had drowned in the very same public pool, a decade before he had first heard the sound of crying coming from beneath the surface of the deep end. After learning about this unfortunate accident, a young Forster refused to visit the local pool again, instead volunteering to do housework whenever his family decided they'd go swimming. As had followed each of the previous stories shared aboard Observatory Site 13, shortly after Forster had told the crew about the crying at the deep end of the pool, an abnormality was detected coming from X0620. Random bursts of gravitational waves started to appear, tiny blips that were picked up by photosensory equipment. One of these incoming bursts spiked while being recorded, causing radio astronomer Forster's eardrums to burst. He suffered a seizure and immediately needed to be restrained and taken to the medical bay by the rest of the crew. Forster was no longer present on any of the station's audio or video recording devices, implying due to his symptoms, he remained in the medical bay, or worse. At this time, any subsequent communication between Observatory Site 13 and the SCP Foundation back on Earth was sporadic and unreliable. After 3 days, the Foundation received a distress call. However, the audio recording was distorted considerably. After cleaning up the static on the audio file, Foundation personnel detected overlays of laughter mixed with screams. The closing recording from Observatory Site 13 was made by the expedition lead, Neil, on April the 19th of 2020. He recounted a story that was very familiar to the Foundation personnel back on Earth that heard it. It was a story about a group of researchers sent to observe a black hole from aboard a space station. They were told to sit and listen for a long year and a half, to keep watching and occasionally poking at the black hole until something poked back. They thought they could unlock the door to the cosmos, pierce the darkness with glass and steel. They thought that if they listened close enough, they would hear the voice of the gods. But gaze into the darkness long enough, and you will find your demons. Pay close enough attention, and you will hear our screams, crushed under the weight of gravity. The stories being told by the crew had given something access to the universe. Whatever it was used Neil's voice to speak, as if it recounted what happened to each of the crew. Chief Engineer Graham was sucked out of the airlock to remain in his ignorance forever. Scope Specialist Hart was blinded, only seeing the horrors of the endless night. Radio astronomer Forster, who refused to heed the voices, now bled profusely from his ears. He shall hear our whispers for eternity. But there had been 4 crew members aboard OS-13. What had happened to Neil? Did you hear the one about the researcher who went mad and murdered his colleagues aboard a space station? He threw them out of the airlock one by one, then logged a distress call so that others would come. By the time you hear this recording, it will be too late. Any further contact with the station ceased after this recording. The Foundation had dispatched a team consisting of members of Mobile Task Force Nu-9, the Null Chasers, to OS-13 in order to evacuate the personnel on board, retrieve any data logs aboard the station, and then activate its self-destruct protocols. After this remaining audio transmission from the observatory site, updated emergency orders were sent to MTF Nu-9 en route. Terminate any personnel on site, and under no circumstances communicate with any of the survivors. SCP-4827 is the designation given to the series of anomalous occurrences that took place aboard OS-13, which had been observing a black hole, X0620, 5,000 light-years from Earth. As a way to alleviate the stress of this assignment, research staff shared ghost stories that seemed to proceed with various mechanical faults, accidents, and out-of-character behavior from members of the crew. Each time, the resultant incident paralleled certain details of the ghost stories told around the black hole. Now check out Miniature Black Hole SCP-123 and SCP-2006 Too Spooky for more.